A gradual decline in our federal infrastructure investment has resulted in an alarming number of crumbling roads, bridges, and an undersupply of affordable, low-income housing and community-based investments. In addition, structural inequities within our tax code are exacerbating those infrastructure deficiencies within historically marginalized communities. All the while, our energy and transportation frameworks continue to rely on fossil fuels and other outdated technologies, putting America behind its Paris Climate Agreement obligations. Our inadequate infrastructure networks will limit the economy's growth if we don't act, a trajectory that we cannot afford, particularly as we continue to dig out from the COVID recession. Now is the moment that we can and must address the towering economic challenges America faces. We have the opportunity to make smart investments that create good jobs, protect against costly environmental disasters, and fortify our economy. Dating back to the industrial era, investment in public infrastructure resources has driven our nation's economic potential. From FDR and the New Deal to President Dwight Eisenhower and the Interstate Highway Act to President Obama and the 2009 American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, major federal infrastructure initiatives stimulated economic growth, led to modernized energy and transportation networks, and created well-paying middle-class jobs. Under the leadership of President Biden, we again have the opportunity to propel our country forward, but not only updating outdated infrastructure networks, but also with investments in reducing carbon emissions and actions to mitigate the threat of climate change. Today, we will hear from an expert panel of witnesses on the tools within the tax code that can spur investments in all facets of our nation's infrastructure, including surface transportation, energy generation, water, housing, and public buildings, and beyond. I'm encouraged to see that there is already strong interest among our committee members to strengthen and expand clean energy and energy efficiency with incentives built into the code. It's in the best interest of all Americans that tax code opportunities encourage investments in renewable energy and rewards individuals that shift their consumption to zero-emission vehicles and more efficient homes. These incentives are investments in preserving a healthy planet for our children. Let me especially thank Mike Thompson and Earl Blumenauer for their work on our proposals, which has been supported by all the committee Democrats, that will drive aggressive emissions reduction benefiting all communities, especially disadvantaged communities, and indeed will support the creation of good jobs. Many of the investments needed to revitalize our nation's infrastructure will come from state and local governments. Through tax-exempt and federally supported bond financing mechanisms, Congress can support these crucial state and local investments by lowering upfront capital costs and broadening the pool of potential investors. Last Congress, the House passed a number of bond financing improvements that this committee anchored, including a permanent revival of Build America bonds, reinstatement of advance refundings, and a holistic expansion of private activity bonds. My guess is that all members of this committee support those initiatives. I'm optimistic that this committee will again secure the inclusion of a similar suite of provisions in any infrastructure financing legislation that comes to the floor. Too often, low-end communities are excluded from realizing the benefits of tax legislation. So I'm pleased that this hearing will provide us with an opportunity to explore the success of community development tax incentives. These incentives are proven to drive targeted investment in underserved communities. For example, since its inception in 1980, the low-income housing tax credit has been directly responsible for the construction of millions of low-income rental housing units. Similarly, New Markets tax credits provide opportunities for accredited nonprofit organizations with resources to make community development initiatives economically viable and sustainable. The success of these incentives should serve as a model for developing tax tools designed to provide a direct benefit to communities that are often left behind. We must also examine how the inequities within our tax code limit tribal governments' abilities to leverage tax-exempt financing and other tax tools. Barriers such as essential government tests prevent tribal authorities from deploying tax-exempt debt proceeds for uses otherwise available to state and local governments. This asymmetry prevents tribal governments from acquiring financing for critical government services like housing and health care. We're holding this hearing at a time when members across the country, and indeed from both sides of the aisle, are hearing calls from their constituents for a significant infrastructure investment. Now is the time to move landmark legislation that scales to the magnitude of the nation's challenges. Again, I applaud President Biden for his initiative and leadership in putting forward the American Jobs Plan. His proposal calls on Congress to pass infrastructure legislation that will not only modernize our nation's broadband, energy, and transportation systems, but also make a significant down payment on combating climate change. And all of these public investments will create good, well-paying jobs to support the middle class and strengthen our economy. Finally, I'm hopeful that today's conversation will help lead to a bipartisan area of agreement. I'm eager, sincerely, to hear from our Republican colleagues on the infrastructure priorities that they've embraced and constructive proposals to build upon the committee's work.